Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and once again, I am joined by a full table of hosts. I'm joined by Dr. Scott Keith, Adam Francisco, Rod Rosenblatt, and Dan Van Voorhis. We are doing this Christianity in America series with Dan, and he's helping walk us through it, which is awesome. This is cool. This is like getting to take a class I didn't get to take in undergrad, and so it's pretty awesome for me. And we're gonna just kind of listen and ask questions once again. We are in part 2 of Dan's outline, which is the founding generation. So we're gonna get to ask some interesting questions about the founding fathers and documents. And
yeah, this is really one of the periods that I find people have the most questions about, right? And it makes sense. What sells in terms of books and what it's the founding generation.
There's American heroes.
Yeah,
in here.
absolutely. And so when it comes to not only the founding generation, which is interesting in its own right, but when you take the question of, are we a Christian nation, or you take these sort of theological questions, oftentimes people want to try and kind of put them together. Okay, so what did they believe? And we have, these outrageous stories and tales of George Washington and of, Jefferson, with these almost like they're saints. These stories that evolve around them of George Washington being taken up into heaven and shown the whole continent, and this will be yours.
Apotheosis of Washington.
Washington, absolutely
Beautiful.
And so it's fascinating. There's so much silly stuff, unfortunately, that you have to wade through, and sometimes, like is often the case, the answers aren't as sexy, if I can say that, as maybe we want them to be.
This isn't virtually wasted, but you can't say sexy.
Okay, this is sometimes it's not. It doesn't give us the answers are kind of mundane. They're not not always super interesting in terms of they were all doing this or all doing that. But the faith of the founding fathers, I think it's an interesting question for me. I always want to tie it to the Constitution.
Yep.
Because one is just an interesting conversation. The second is what they put down and then how that's affected centuries after. And so to look at them, I think that's interesting, but usually in light of how they came to this idea of, the Free Exercise Clause and the Establishment Clause, which are the first parts of the First Amendment.
Well, cool. Well, before we get into that, just a couple announcements. If you're a fan of the Thinking Fellows, maybe this is your first time listening, there's a lot of shows in the backlog of this particular podcast. We've been doing this for over 3 years. We're in our 4th year. We'll have our 4th birthday next February. We have shows on apologetics, Christian history, Christian doctrine, all that. But we also happen to have a family of another 13 shows around us in the 1517 Podcast Network. 1517.org/podcast. You can go check that all out. Between all of the shows, I'm pretty certain there's over 1,000 episodes of various podcasts in there. So there's quite a lot of stuff to go listen to. And then another thing, 1517 every year puts on a conference called the Here We Still Stand Conference. If you've been listening to the show for a long time, you know about this because you may have been there and you got to meet us and be there for the live podcasting day. You've probably heard the episodes that have come out of that conference. If you're new to the show and you haven't heard of it, it's an awesome gathering with, I think it's the best theological conference I've ever been to. It's put on in an extraordinary way, extraordinary food, great conversation. There's a lot of scheduled downtime for mutual conversation, things like that. And there's less than 100 tickets left to this event. It's in San Diego, California. You can find out everything at herewestillstand.org. I'll put in links to the show. If you're a listener of this show or any show on the podcast network, you can get $25 off of your registration, which is $199 right now, with the code PNET19 at checkout. I will put the code and the links to signing up in there. Again, it's $199 right now. This is $25 off. And during the middle of the summer, if there are tickets left towards the end, the price does go up one more time. So if you've been thinking about it or you just heard about it, now might be a good time to talk with the people who you need to make arrangements with and consider coming. All right. We can now dive into the episode. So, I guess the big question is the one that's been on Rod's mind all morning, and so I guess I'll just let Rod ask it.
Well, I know I'm not alone, but I keep hearing these themes of Christian America and books on Christian America, and my reaction is, if I'm correct, it was about 50% deists among the founders and about 50% some kind of Calvinist Christians. But it's an interesting question to me. I want to know if that business about a Christian America is true. Then it's better that I know it than not know it.
It's such a hard. It's a weird question sometimes in talking about, is America a Christian nation? Because you could go a lot of places. The way I suspect most people ask it, the answer is no. The answer is that it was not a Christian nation in the sense of self-conscious Christian men coming up with a way of running a nation in a way that somehow uses gospel principles or what have you. That's not the case. Even saying these were self-conscious sort of Christian men who were putting together a secular state wasn't necessarily the case. You can really break them down in a couple different categories, but the largest category are kind of, a deist Christian blend. And you have a couple who are going to be very much on the conservative Christian Orthodox side.
Right.
That's Sam Adams. That's Patrick
Henry.
Thank you. I always go Hamilton, who's the Scottish martyr. And you'll have them like that. On the far other side, you'll always have a Thomas Paine or a Thomas Jefferson who want nothing supernatural at all. If you've seen Jefferson's Bible, he cuts out everything that's miraculous. And the majority of them are between that.
Okay.
And so they're kind of with general Enlightenment ideas, trying to put something together that honors the faith that most of them have, at least as a heritage, but they at the same time want to keep away from the religious issues that were happening over in the continent. I would say the best way of understanding the founding generation is not as necessarily Christians, but they are in the Judeo-Christian tradition, working right in the Enlightenment, and with heavy on reason, light on supernatural. That's just what the world was like in the 18th century. You mentioned the other half being Calvinists. I would say that's true to an extent. Everyone who's coming over, for the most part, they're going to either be coming from the Anglican Church, or they're going to be coming from, maybe Scottish Presbyterian Church, at least these first fellows, or the Netherlands where it's Calvinist. So everyone who's coming over is going to be of the kind of Reformate Calvinist mix, but all a little bit different. I would say the most important thread there would be the professors that they brought to teach in their colleges. And we've talked before how literate this community was. Princeton especially took its professors from Scotland and the Scottish Kirk tradition and the Scottish common sense philosophy tradition and the Scottish Presbyterian tradition. And so I think that's why there's such an emphasis on that. If there's any kind of confessional Orthodox Christianity, it's going to be of that kind.
Okay.
In terms of the Anglicans, those who leave the Anglican Church either end up dissenting completely or they're going to catch on with the Wesleys. And the Wesleys, of course, the Methodists, are kind of that halfway place between Anglicanism and open field. Although they would go to open fields, it was kind of the revivalistic version of Anglicanism.
I say this because having studied under Dr. Montgomery for so many years, I joke about it and say, in the 50s, it was common for those of us, for Americans, to see a communist behind every bush. And if you studied under Dr. Montgomery, he saw a Republican behind every bush. So his book is The Shaping of America.
And he's taking on some of these pious myths.
Yes.
That sometimes are propagated on the right of, I'm thinking of David Barton.
Right.
Who wrote this book that was, basically Thomas Jefferson is an Orthodox Christian.
Yeah.
And you can go on Wikipedia and see the whole controversy, but he most definitely was not. and the research shows it. And unfortunately, there have been, in Christian publishing, there have been some things that just don't see the right kind of editorial process or the right kind of historical minds, and so something like this gets tossed into it. So, beware that. Anyone who's these are Enlightenment characters, right? And that's where I think the whole issue of supernaturalism is the watershed thing, and you can you're on one side or the other.
Got it.
And I don't think it's too dissimilar today, but if they're cool with the supernatural, they're going to kind of hang out with the more Orthodox, and if not, but that's the key, right?
Got it.
And it's based on the philosophy, right? They're reading Hume and Reid and Descartes and all the like.
We've been using the word deist or deism.
Yeah.
Should we define it? I mean,
please do, Adam.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily want to, but I don't know.
Well,
if listeners will be schooled.
It was the first Western move away from what Dan just called Orthodox Christianity. It was radically anti-supernatural, but they said to the Christians, "Don't panic. We're just going to replace the God of Scripture with the God of nature."
Or the God of reason, they might use.
Or the God of reason.
Same idea, yeah.
Like the watchmaker God.
Yeah, that's right.
And someone has noted that it's only in a society that's made a watch where they can talk about a watchmaker God, right? They have to. That of course the 18th centuryers are going to think like that because they just invented a watch and they can figure that out. But it is. A peculiar way of looking at God, but very common in the 18th century.
Yeah, you had
watchmaker.
You had no real doctrine of sin, and so you had no real need of a doctrine of redemption either.
And this is mostly comes from the French Enlightenment, yeah?
Yeah, I would say the French and German Enlightenment, which is a little bit later. The Enlightenment is, Adam, we've talked in the past when we taught at Concordia together. I taught the Enlightenment classes, and I always stressed there are threads in the Enlightenment tradition, and some are rather conservative. Francis Bacon kicking off the English is, pretty empirical and is going to follow kind of an analytic line eventually. But the French, especially around the time of the Revolution and the throwing off of the church and the beginning of the cult of the supreme
of
being. That's the Robespierre when he comes in charge. Takes the Catholic Church out and says now everyone needs to believe in the cult of the supreme being. And it has two rules. There's a God, be nice to one another. I mean, it's that, and I mean, it really is that watered down.
It's kind of ironic that
that's kind of the watering, not the watering
nice
down.
to each other when he's popping heads off.
I mean, it's funny, we laugh at it, but Scott, what were you going to say?
I'd say that's sort of the boiling down of the Decalogue.
Yeah.
Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, all your mind.
Yeah.
Second unto it, love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But with no anything behind it. Yeah. And the idea was that Robespierre, 150 years late to the game, thinks we all have to have the same religion or we can't possibly run a country.
Yeah.
Well, don't you read your history, man? That's what we were doing in the 16th century, and it turns out. And so there are some people that are afflicted, you might say, with one of my favorite conversations is between Adams and Jefferson. Jefferson loved the French, thought the French and their cult of supreme being was the best thing ever. And there's a letter John Adams writes to him where he hears this new word from Jefferson called ideology. And he says, what on earth is this ideology you're talking about, this French disease of building everything off of one premise? And, it was really an interesting way of seeing some of the excesses of the French Enlightenment, which is where, tying it back, we see the deism, start to flourish in America.
And is it true that deism doesn't really come to America until like the 1760s at the earliest? I mean,
it's hard when you say coming to, in terms of popularity.
In terms of books and ideas. And
nobody's a deist before that. Or at least, if you're a deist, you're quiet about it, right? If you're a deist, for ease, think of Hume. I always like to think of Hume as kind of the first guy who says nuts to the supernatural. He was born in 1710. All right, so just by putting his life together, think 1750. From then on is when we start to get this, we don't need the supernatural. There are people who did it before. And I think one of the guys that gets overlooked a lot in the American tradition, or helping the American tradition, is Spinoza. Spinoza, the Spanish, then he moved to the Netherlands, Reformation character, who was
a pantheist.
A pantheist, maybe, yeah, all sorts of things, but had this idea of just the God of your own understanding in a way. And that's going to become even more influential than a supreme cult of one being, that Robespierre puts out.
Do they leave in the morality? Because it seems like that was a prominent thing in the early colonial days.
Oh yeah, that's what they would say is we don't need the supernatural
for the morality,
because it's about this is our text on statecraft and proper living, and so the morality is there. Jefferson's Bible is just a Lutheran would just say, well, you cut out the gospel and you left in the law.
So when you and then too when you're referring to God, it's mostly within the confines of natural law. So this is what's natural.
Yes, yeah, it is. They were big on natural law, and it was because they didn't have another kind of law. And so they had to find that something's going to fill the void, and it's going to be God with a white beard, who made it and then stepped back, and then some natural law which the most elite of us can figure out and teach the plebes.
So a God revealing the law to an individual through like an inspiration as it's written down in Scripture, because that's supernatural.
That's supernatural. It's off
that's
the
out, but we can still find this just through natural law.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's how they marketed it to people. Christian people, they said, you're not losing that much. Every doctrine that you value, we can find in nature.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Lutheran tradition, we go back to this idea of people oftentimes quote Luther and talk about when Luther talks about the two books.
Yeah.
The two books of Revelation. You just have to remember that book of Revelation, that quote unquote book of Revelation that doesn't come through Jesus, it might be beautiful, but it's damning.
It's all law.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of law, talk about the Constitution.
Yeah,
That's what these guys made.
That's,
and I think it is. It's fun to talk about sort of individuals and ideas. But when the rubber hits the road, they put this in a text, and we can look at that text and say, what did they mean? The text, of the Constitution that we're talking about, obviously, is the Constitution. It's the Bill of Rights, and it's the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. I'll just read it. It's quick. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. ... goes on to talk about speech and the like. But that's what, for our cases, we're interested in seeing how the religious tradition in America has built itself out of the Constitution, saying they can't make a law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibit people from exercising it freely. So going back to the last episode, it's religious liberty instead of toleration. And it's the federal government can't establish a religion because we saw Massachusetts said, we're not the federal government. We can do what we want.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, and it flew then. And I think obviously it's a historical story for another time, but the mishmashing of the ideas of what federal and state and state becomes its own wacky story. But the whole conversation, which is a fascinating conversation about church and state, and usually we mean Christianity of a Protestant variety, although it's to apply to all of them, that's the majority. It comes down to this little bit. The government can't do those things. Otherwise, have at it. And so this, obviously, there have been cases and whole classes where the Supreme Court has kind of tried to figure out, okay, what does this mean? And, Scott, you said last time the thing where today we think of it as...
Yeah, the state being protected from the church.
Yeah.
It definitely not that when you read it.
Yeah, because those ugly Christians are going to come to your, and picket on your civic grounds.
In hearing you read it again, not that I'm completely unfamiliar with it, I don't want to imply that, but it's interesting. You said in the last episode that it's supposed to protect the church from the state, and I said as opposed to today where it seems like we're protecting the state from the church. The reading of that is to protect the individual from the state.
That's the subtext of every. Yeah, that's the first.
Enacting a religion that they then must practice, which coming, like you said, if you kind of see these things happening at the same time in Europe and here, they're coming out of 30 Years' War, they're living under, the whoever the king is, that's the religion, and they're still trying to find how does this work, and it doesn't work, and thus wars and everything. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Not only do you not have to practice the religion of your ruler, but your ruler isn't allowed, i.e. the state, isn't allowed to enact a law that says you must.
Yeah. Yeah. It is. It's protecting the individual, and there's going to be obviously that concern.
Is there at this point in history too, do you start seeing a decline of like the sort of the homicide of heretics, burning of heretics, drowning of heretics, and things like that?
Well, the last, it was the witch trials in Salem, which were the one actually just little time. We didn't really do that in America and in the colonies. This is a one isolated incident. I mentioned on the last show, 14 women, 1 man, 1 dog. In Europe, it's thousands.
Yeah.
So sometimes we look at the Salem witch trials and we say, oh, those sort of medieval backwards colonists who believed in... No, it was just one little thing for a couple years because they all went crazy because there were so many dissenting religious groups in the area and there were some problems and they needed a scapegoat. But we don't see blasphemy laws like you see in Europe. You know, in Europe, they're still hanging people for blasphemy into the late 17th century.
Okay.
I mean, it really, but in America, we don't have that tradition. So, you know, when it comes to this part of the Constitution, it's probably worth noting, too, with the Bill of Rights. Everyone could tell you, or people could tell you, well, this was edited, or at first was this, or it was this, and then they went through 4 drafts. This part right here, the beginning of the First Amendment, we don't have record of it changing. I mean, this was understood. So many of the states had worked on their own state laws, trying to work with the church and the state, and they all came to kind of the same conclusion, that it was one of just the foregone conclusions in the Constitution. They could just write that down and say, there we go. We know what that means.
It's interesting because, you know, I think specifically the Second Amendment always gets sort of seen, a rhetoric around it will be that this sort of liberty it can be dangerous. But I see this in the beginnings of the First Amendment as well. Religious liberty to this extent is very dangerous if you know what the powers of ideas are.
Sure.
I mean, right? Because if it's really not limiting even a made-up religion or something like that, these things make truth claims and inspire people to do
lots of
things.
No, well, absolutely. I mean, that's to give religious liberty, as I mentioned, is a much more dangerous thing than to simply tolerate, which is what Europe did post-Reformation.
Right.
And in some ways has continued to do in some places. Fine, you can do that over there, rather than saying, it's a blank slate, do what you will. It's going to cause a lot more problems.
Yeah.
You know, I decided, hey, I should pull up a couple of the constitutional battles, you know, sort of constitutional cases. And so I pulled it up, and it's just like case after case after case. I'm scrolling on my iPad, and it's 100 cases, because it's messy. But that's one of the things that when it comes to the founding generation and the Constitution, they're going to err on the side of giving you the freedom,
Yes.
and then work on, well, cleaning up the stuff that might go wrong later. And they have had to. there have been lots of cases. I think can I bring up one case? Because I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, go for
it. Just to tell you about the kind of where we're at and how we understand this First Amendment. There were 2 cases in 2011 that both dealt with the same thing, one in Texas and one in Kentucky. And in Texas, it's called Van Orden versus Rick Perry. It was 10 commandments that were being put in a courthouse, or that were in the courthouse, and they wanted to take it down. So there's a big case, Van Orden v. Perry. At the same time, in Kentucky, there's a state house that also has some 10 commandments. That goes to court. McCreary versus something county. I'll have to look that up later. And what happens here, so both happen at the same time, they both go to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules that in Texas, they can keep it up. They rule in Kentucky, they can't.
What the heck?
Okay?
Why?
And this is the exact same court, and it was 5-4 for both of them.
What?
Now, here's where, and this is where the standard kind of law is, McCreary County versus Kentucky, I think. What they said is, in Texas, it's part of a larger picture, and the 10 Commandments are in there with other pictures that just kind of show us the Judeo-Christian heritage of the law, and that's why that's there. Whereas in McCreary County, they believed in that courthouse, it was 10 Commandments, and it was there to say, listen up.
You done broke these.
You done broke these. Exactly. and so the same court said, you can't do it that way, but you can do it that way.
That's interesting. So, like, one can be a symbol of the law, right? And the other,
and that's a great way,
the ruling law.
And that's in some ways a great way of looking at the founding generation, saying, to say this is part of our heritage, sure. To say we're going to base everything on these 10 laws.
It's not true.
No, that's not going to happen. So I like that case because it's the same court, but it also shows us the difference between saying, hey, in our heritage, this is important, and, oh, no, this is what we're all going to do, religious liberty and toleration. Yeah, other questions? This is fun. This is like stump the professor at the constitutional questions.
Well, I don't know. I think it's interesting because we might ask, why do we care what the what the founders believed religiously? But it's
I think
clear.
If you want to say you don't, that's okay. So long as you say, but whatever helps us understand this text, we're going to find.
Yeah.
And I think their writings, I think Jefferson and Adams writing together, there's a book by Joseph Ellis. You'll want to put this in your notes. Joseph Ellis, Founding Brothers. And it deals with this founding generation. And it's got a chapter on the letters between Jefferson and Adams. And those guys loved and hated And I mean, it's such an amazing story. And you probably know they both died on the exact same day, which happened to be July 4th, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
Yep.
Although John Adams said it should have been July the 3rd. That was the real day. That was Independence Day.
Is that the day they mailed it?
That's the day he signed it. Yeah, so he wanted it to be on that day, and he knew that the day Jefferson signed it
would be
the day because he knew that hog wanted all the attention.
That would be what I'd be like if it were Adam that signed it on the 4th and I signed it on the 3rd. I'd be like, it was really the 3rd.
The 1517 Declaration of Rights. And so, their relationships, I think is really interesting to look into those. And the state of Virginia, this is where, prior to the Constitutional Convention, a lot of these interesting questions about religion and the state, especially state religion, Anglicanism, which was solid there, is these things are coming together. How do we work with an established state? In Pennsylvania, they were dealing with how do you deal with no established religion and everybody doing what they're doing and no central tithe to a central building? Is this possible? Can it happen? And we saw, it can happen. So, like I said, I think whatever helps you understand what that text says, that's what you want.
The thing that I always think is interesting is how many Christians land on the side of wanting to have Christian influence in state institutions.
Yeah.
And, you can kind of understand if this were 300 years ago and everybody is Christian-ish of some kind or sort. Yeah. But the fact that they don't sort of see the implications to what that means in a pluralistic society for people of other religions, that if you allow Christian prayer in, you're going to allow all sorts of prayer in. If you allow, Christian this in, you're allowing all sorts of whatever in. And that in, where we are now, that really the best case scenario is for the state to stay out of it.
Yeah.
Altogether.
Oh, yeah. And there's a case here in California that went to the Supreme Court, Elk Grove versus something. And it had to do with prayer, I believe, before graduation. And the argument basically it fell on, okay, fine, then anyone can
That's
say
right.
prayer.
That's where it goes.
And you want to, and that becomes an issue. I think this too, especially where I'm from, where we live here in Southern California, I think the 20th century, most American Christians, especially Protestant evangelicals, actually worked from a toleration model, not a liberty model. In other words, we are the ascendant ones,
and now we'll
allow you, we'll tolerate all of you. Now we're living with much more just religious liberty.
Yeah.
And we're thinking, we liked it better before. Yeah, well, constitutional republic is a...
Yeah, you end up with Wicca.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to sympathize a little bit, it is easier to live when your rulers share the same worldview as you.
Yeah.
Right? And there's something to that desire.
Yeah, it's funny. And this is where there's been so much work done on the religion of presidents. And if you guys want to quiz me, pop quiz on the religious inclinations of any of the presidents, I'll give it to you because it's something I like to memorize. But one of the things that you'll find is, for me, I don't know, me...
Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah, Theodore Roosevelt was a Presbyterian. And Hoover was a Methodist. Yeah, there's 2 Methodists. There are 4 non-Trinitarian presidents. You want to mark those and avoid them. John Adams, John Q. Adams, William Howard Taft, and Millard Fillmore. Non-Trinitarians. But what I bring that up is...
How many Muslim presidents?
How many Muslim presidents? I'm not even going to...
Just kidding.
Yeah. Well,
it got really hot here. I'm trying to era.
Sometime I'll hear you, not here, but discourse on... I'm going to defend that Islam isn't a religion like Christianity, Judaism, Confucianism, the Eastern religions. It's something else.
Here's how the courts would deal with it. I think this is where, if you're doing something that does not have a state purpose, right? If you're doing something that is problematic and does not have any kind of positive state purpose, the government can tell you to stop. So one of the big cases is, I'm like damning myself by saying, here's the name of the case, and I can't remember the name of the case. But there's a very famous case with Mormons and bigamists. It's 1879, that was the year. And it was, they want to have multiple wives, but we don't think that is good for the state. We think this is an interesting 19th century way of thinking, but we think that is so detrimental to the state that it does not... That it
qualify.
Actually doesn't qualify. And then since then, okay, what about a Jewish person who wants to have their store open on Sunday, even though there's a blue law? What if there's a Jehovah's Witness or a Seventh-day Adventist that wants Saturday off? Use of peyote. I mean, all of these cases. And it just shows you how messy it is.
Yeah.
But I think we've done a pretty good job balancing it out. But where is the state? We all have different ideas about what it should be.
What we all would agree on, I think, is the simple observation that the Constitution was primarily written to limit government and allow most freedom to the individual.
In certain cases, absolutely. With regards to religion, with regards to speech. I mean, that whole First Amendment is saying, before we get anywhere, these things don't touch. Later on, we'll talk about, commerce. But for now...
Is it fair to say that the Constitution shows us a liberty model, and that because most of the people involved, and then even living in the colonies before that, and then the states after that, were Christian, that it kind of got to be seen as a tolerance model?
Yeah.
Even though the Constitution itself is
liberty model.
Is a liberty model.
No, I think it's a really good point. I think that's what it is in so many ways. The liberty model, when it comes to, it's important to say that First Amendment. That First Amendment, everyone will agree, is trying to proscribe, trying to get rid of, trying to hold back the powers of government so that individual freedom can flourish in these areas with regards to religion and speech. And so hands off. But you're right, Scott. It became just because, we were generally Christian. And
so we'll tolerate.
Yeah, we'll tolerate you. But...
we still want the schools.
Exactly. So what do you do in a public school when they're going to be reading something? I mean, public schools are a very difficult question because, if you're not going to have something and you're going to sort of maybe remove it, if there was a kind of Judeo-Christian there, well, something's going to move in its place.
That's right. Yeah.
So what are we going to put there? And I think that's a question that we can sit down and say, what should be there? In some places, we've seen ridiculousness and we've seen stuff come in that's loony, but I think the question has to be, is there a way of doing this?
Yep.
Interestingly enough, I think Lutherans have an answer. I think Lutherans with Two Kingdoms and with their emphasis on education have a way of getting in there and saying, hey, we have an answer. But unfortunately...
That even occurred with one of the founders who happened to be Lutheran.
One of the founders...
Yeah, forget the name, but he was in constant contact with both Adams and Jefferson.
Yeah. And James Madison loved Luther. Maybe not theologically.
The distinction between church and state to Luther.
To Luther, yeah.
His roots are here.
And what's fascinating, and we'll get into this on the later shows here, is the Lutherans, us guys, have had almost no voice.
Yeah.
And we've got something to say.
Yeah.
Now, our tradition, which doesn't understand religious liberty and which is it has been more interested in keeping its identity and not messing with the baddies on the outside, has unfortunately left us insulated.
Yep.
And not going, and I'm not talking about some center in Washington, D.C. for government affairs.
Right.
I'm talking about actually getting in there. And,
ironically, it's called the Center for Religious Liberty.
Yeah.
I don't know on this show. I don't know what I can say or not say.
I have an online essay published about it if you want, on 1517's site that you can go see.
So, this point is simple accuracy.
Yeah.
Lutheran Center for Religious Liberty, I believe his name.
Yes.
Lutheran Center.
LCRL.
Yeah, and they said we have some, and it, what have you. But I think, and it's for later episodes to talk about these Lutheran distinctions, which really add to the conversation. And when you see some of them that we're looking at that, it helps even more.
Well, I mean, it's interesting is the government can sort of be limited in its ability to force religious issues on to people, but it's hard to. This philosophy is in the realm of the religious. There are religious implications to sort of everything you do. Freedom of speech, freedom of...
Let me just throw one little wrinkle in here to kind of... One of the issues where a lot of this is going to come up, you have to remember, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights is for the federal government.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to states things, of course, we have the 14th Amendment, which is going to bring together state and federal law to some extent for the due process and protection of the individual. We can't always just run right to the First Amendment with church and state if, say, the state board is doing something. And most of the time, education, other places are state boards.
Yeah.
And that, in some way, I would be interested if say, Utah wanted to say, we want to establish the Mormon Church.
Yeah.
Right? And we'll tolerate everyone else, or we'll give everyone else
Right.
liberty, but as a state, we want to do this. I think they'd have a fight.
Yeah, isn't that type of interpretation of the Constitution that'll stop right around the end of the Civil War?
In terms of
Like states.
States being able to pass laws that would be seen as constitutional, federally unconstitutional.
1879.
Yeah.
Is where that kind of dies, and that's with the Mormons and the polygamy case. But it's I mean, Christian history is obviously what I'm interested in doing, and looking at America and this kind of how the church has come alongside it in a way, and the story of how the two have interacted. It's not the same story. And I if I can say this, I look at a lot of Christian history books and on this day books because of the almanac that I do. And it's fascinating how hard it is for people to distinguish between history and Christian history, and how oftentimes they're just kind of blended together as if it's one story. And they'll be, I think we want to be careful with that.
Yeah.
And say the church's story is the church's story, the state's story is the state's story. And when they are, interacting as they should be with just a hedge protecting, that's the story. But
That's interesting because, like you said, I think that's probably very Lutheran, just simply on the church has this unique role of proclaiming and delivering the gospel.
I mean, we say two kingdoms in our parlance, and I just think that for the historian, there's a reason why. I forget, there was somebody, maybe Bob Kolb or someone, no, it was someone told Bob Kolb, is there something that they put in the water in Lutheran Americans that makes them all historians? Because so many of the historians were all Lutherans.
Born of the university.
Yeah,
Yeah.
born of the university.
Yeah.
And I remember over in Scotland where they hadn't heard of a Lutheran for 400 years.
Yeah.
They'd be like, there are a few. I think they're historians or something. And I think a lot of that is this two kingdom, at least the way we were trained, the two kingdom approach to not being afraid to look at the text and say, what does it say?
Yeah.
And then what does the church say? Fantastic. Is there interaction here?
Yeah.
Usually.
Interesting.
And then move from there. But, this stuff is all pretty basic. I mean, basic enough. The colonies, 2,000 people, a constitution where they wrote things down. Where we're headed, I think, is going to make Rod's head explode. Because when we move into the awakenings, right, it's going to get a lot messier. And people are going to want to bring the Christian story and the American story together.
Yeah.
And all sorts of things. Really, really interesting.
Would it be fair to say, because the founders didn't intend to build a Christian nation, but they left room for sort of people to Christianize the nation?
Well, I mean, if we look at the as we did in the beginning, the theological makeup of the people in the room who were writing the Constitution, who were at that convention, and it's a mix. It's deists, it's Christians, it's supernaturalists, it's anti-supernaturalists, and they had to write something that let all of them be. And that's part of the genius, to even have that kind of those four people in a room in the 18th century without knives at each other's throats. That's saying something.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, cool. This was a fun episode again. I really thank you, Dan, for coming on and
Hey, this is
outlining
a
this
blast.
series for us. If you've been enjoying the Thinking Fellows or any of the other shows at 1517, please do consider supporting our efforts here. We are donor funded in everything that we do, so you can go to 1517.org. At the top right of the page there's a donate button. If you go ahead and click that, you can fill out a form, and it's pretty basic. You can choose them out. Monthly reoccurring donations really help out for the show, as these sort of we try to continue and not have gaps in programming and things like that. So if you are able to, if you can support us, that would be amazing, and we would really appreciate it. So thank you for listening to this episode. We'll catch you next time. Bye.